Found myself at the Commando Training Centre. We know what a good Marine looks like, because they're all good. If you know, you know. It's a constant learning environment. It was Kipling who said, success and failure, imposters both the same. And be under no illusions, military skiing is a little bit different than civilian skiing. Like your podcast, by the way, which I think is excellent. I wish I'd had a decade ago. Norwegian environment is an energy giver and an approver of self, right? So I would advise choosing your gurus and advisors very carefully. What we also wanted to do was inspire people to get outdoors. I mean, the whole thing started with an email from me to Tommy, fancy setting up an outdoor clothing business. The name, which roughly translates something like...
In this episode of Sports and Outdoor Mentors, I chat with Steve Howth, the CEO and co-founder of UK outdoor brand Jöttnar. Jöttnar was born from a life spent in extreme environments during 20 years of military service and the belief outdoor apparel could be done better. We talk about the challenges of founding an outdoor apparel brand, the decision to focus on delivering only the best product, and the similarities and differences between leading in the military and civilian life, plus much, much more. Before we begin the episode, I have one request. Less than 50% of people watching or listening now are subscribed. So please hit the subscribe or follow button so we can inspire and provide valuable insights to even more people. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Steve, so 34 years ago, at the age of 19, you took the decision to join the Royal Marines. And then 21 years later, you left and shortly afterwards established Jöttnar. Now, we'll come back to Jöttnar a little bit later for sure, but I'm really interested to understand what were the key elements that led you actually up to that decision to Jöttnar and just understand maybe a little bit also why in the first place you decided to join the Marines.
And the two are massively interconnected. One flowed into the other quite seamlessly. I suppose I'd start with what led me to join the Marines in the first place. And I'd wanted to do that since I was probably 13, 14 years old. The Falklands War actually was a pivotal moment in my decision for joining that. And I prepared myself and trained myself. I actually dropped out of my A-levels to do it. My brothers were going to university and doing all the orthodox stuff your parents like. I was perhaps a little more wild and found myself at the Commando Training Centre, Royal Marines.
As you do.
As you do, yeah. Age 19. That's the short version of the story. More than happy to go into the long version of the story. I joined as a Marine, so that's as a recruit in the ranks, if you like. And then about 3 years later, I was selected for officer training. So I was commissioned in, I think, 1994. And then for the next, what have we got left, 16, 17 years, I did everything you'd expect a Royal Marines officer to do. And I left as a lieutenant colonel before starting Jöttnar. I suppose it's worth spelling out what the Royal Marines is, what that means. So in brief, it's a British commando formation, and it's got a number of specializations, but probably the most interesting and pertinent one to this conversation is it holds the remit for the United Kingdom's extreme cold weather warfare and mountain warfare capability, or we used to call it Arctic warfare. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? So every year, that formation or elements of that formation will deploy to Norway, which is where my love affair with that amazing country started. And you will train that skill set and develop that skill set. Again, what does that mean I'll give you a synopsis of that. So it would normally be a 3-month deployment, and it could be in Arctic Norway or it could be further south. Wherever you are, it'd be both beautiful and miserable and brutal and horrendous. And we'd roughly divide that training into 3 parts. The first part would be survival training, which starts as, I suppose, how not to die in that environment. And then as your skills develop and your knowledge develop, you learn how to thrive in that environment. And layered on top of that concurrently is mobility training, as we'd call it, which is probably a fancy name for learning how to ski. And be under no illusions, military skiing is a little bit different than civilian skiing.
No lifts, no?
There's no lifts, no. There's no lifts. It's a pretty crude but effective way of, moving men with heavy weights long distances in that sort of terrain.
Yeah.
And, if you can imagine 100 Marines in a line in an Arctic winter storm at night with 100 pounds rucksacks and weapons, that's not a glamorous sight. That's more amusing than it is impressive. But those skills develop, obviously. And then there'll be other elements of mobility, obviously snowshoes, and then the vehicles come in, over snow vehicles, skidoos, track vehicles, helicopters, and aircraft as well. So, and then the third part would be tactical training, bringing that all together and learning how to fight in that environment. And there's some really quite particular demands of that environment, both on the human and on clothing and gear, obviously. Yeah. And I always used to think you could tell a Marine who'd been for his first Norway deployment compared to a Marine who hadn't yet been there. And I loved it. Okay, it was extremely difficult, and it places a lot of demands on you. It's hard just to survive there, never mind to fight there. And I found I fell in love with that country and its people. We worked quite closely with the Norwegian army as well. Very impressive. Tommy, the co-founder of Jöttnar, had a similar background, except he took it one level further. So he was what the Marines call a mountain leader, which is like a globally respected military qualification. So they really are the sort of the guardian of the standards of that capability in the Marines. They also have a reconnaissance capability as well. Very demanding course. Rough equivalent to a civilian mountain guide, not quite the same, but they're the trainers and instructors as well who deliver that training. And I worked with Tommy out there as well. We were deployed in the same location. I found that environment, I was talking about the particular demands of it. So if you're training in the jungle or the heat of the desert or the cold and wet of the coastline as a Marine, you can pretty much sit down. You're not going to die. You might get bitten, but you're not going to die. That can't happen in the Arctic. You have to be pretty switched on. All that said, I found it my most comfortable environment, and I loved it. Now, I think ticking away in the background of all of that was, for both me and for Tommy, was a passion for outdoor sports as well. So I was a pretty low-grade rock climber, sport climbing and trad climbing, which was a popular sport in the Marines as well. But I was in particular a very passionate skier. Okay. And I surfed the crest of that telemark ski revival wave. Again, telemark skiing, a very popular sport in the Marines, not least because of that Norwegian connection. And I would ski 5 times a year and chase the snow around the world and, find myself doing daft stuff such as standing on a snowy mountain in Australia in the British summer just because it had snow and I could ski there, right? So that was definitely my thing. Tommy, for some unknown but possibly forgivable reason, was a snowboarder, but he also managed to regain credibility by being a really accomplished alpinist, and remains so. And he also had a perverse love of the horrors of Scottish winter climbing. Okay. So that's his bag. Okay, so what does all that add up to by the time we came around to form Jöttnar? Something like a couple of guys who know how gear should perform, know how those small details matter, and without those small details being taken care of, how they can lead to, at best discomfort, but at worst a threat to life, right? Both in a civilian context and in a military context, which in terms of survival in those environments aren't that much different. So, we had relied on that gear for many years in civilian and military domains. And essentially, it was the founding of Jöttnar was something like we thought we could make it better. What we also wanted to do was inspire people to get outdoors. We recognized the good it had done for us. Yeah. And I think, as a reliever of many ills, particularly stress or psychological ills, whether it's just minor stress, whether it's PTSD. We often say the mountain can be the cure. And I can certainly go into examples of colleagues of mine who have found that to be so post-Afghanistan with PTSD, finding themselves on the top of Everest in their pursuit of that cure. Yeah. So that was really what led us up to the start point of founding Jöttnar. Yeah. So we set this vision. We wanted to make the finest, most considered outdoor technical clothing in the world, and we wanted to inspire people to get outdoors.
Did you feel at the time that the equipment, the clothing that you had wasn't delivering what you expected, or was it just that you felt that you could do it better, or which kind of one of those was it, or maybe a bit of both? Yeah,
I mean, that's maybe a distinction without much of a difference. So yeah, I would say both, Dan. I mean, military equipment then, it's certainly improved now, but the military clothing was it was quite traditional, sort of cotton-based outers, that sort of ventile approach. Okay. The need for it to have longevity overrode the need for it to be light. So that certainly informed our thinking. Yeah. And we'd see civilian clothing as well, or civilian versions of civilian clothing. And there's lots of good stuff out there. But again, we thought we could just polish that up a little bit.
Yeah. And I don't want this to be a psychology discussion, because that's not the goal, but I just wanted to pick up on something you said. You said that you could tell when somebody in the Marines had been to Norway and done this training and hadn't. Yeah. How? What was the...
Yeah, so...
other than the rugged looks.
Yeah. Prosaically, it would be things like personal administration and effectively looking after yourself such that you're still a capable soldier, no matter what the weather throws at you. Okay. Psychologically, if you want to go there, and I'm quite happy to go there, I think in an environment such as the one Norway offers you for 3 months of the winter, you really find out what you're made of. You'll find out if you're as tough and resilient as you think you are. And people do get found out. I was on attachment as an Arctic warfare instructor to the parachute regiment, for example. I was loaned. And so I was working with non-Marines for the first time. So with units that didn't have that pedigree. And although they're very tough units in their own sectors of expertise, and this is no diss on the parachute regiment, by the way, who I've served with twice and have an enormous amount of respect for. But it was a surprise to those people, just how demanding that environment is. It turns you inside out. I think it teaches a great deal of self-reliance, whilst also demanding that you operate as a team. Yeah.
It's clear that Norway and the Norwegian environment, geography, is a motivator for you, an energy giver. Yeah, I sense as well.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and I'm assuming that the name Jöttnar comes from there.
Yeah. Do you want me to expand on that a little? Yeah, how that arose. So there's no question that that Norwegian environment is an energy giver and a prover of self, right? And the name, which roughly translates something like mountain giant, which has probably become troll these days. The shapes of the rocks becoming trolls in Norwegian myth and legend. So it was a tribute to that country. I'm not sure it's an entirely Norwegian name. I guess it's Proto-Germanic or Icelandic or something. And we added an extra T to just give it a bit of space. Yeah. We still don't know how to pronounce it. The Norwegians, depending on their regional accents, pronounce it differently.
Yeah, I did wonder that myself. Yeah. So I've not been butchering it so far.
No, if you know, you know.
Okay, okay, great. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's move a little bit into founding the brand in those early days. So looking back now, can you share a specific challenge or success in those early days that has influenced you in how you're leading the business today? So I should be clear that you're the CEO of the business today, and obviously you're running the business with your co-founder Tommy, but you're the CEO, the man that's probably making a lot of those decisions. So How do you, anything from those early days that you took away that kind of influencing how you're leading the business today?
Yeah, there's a lot actually, and there still continues to be a lot. It's a constant learning environment, and I used to be skeptical of people who said that sort of thing, but there's no question. And even in the last 6 to 7 to 8 months, as we built out our team and get ready for some serious scale up, I've learned a lot. What we had when we came out of the Marines, so I left as a senior officer. Tommy was relatively senior too, so we were very used to leading people, managing complexity, quantifying risk. Very used to planning, tactical, operational, strategic level planning. I'm very used to contingency planning. And we came from an organization that's well versed, well trained in the doctrine behind all of that. Yeah. So we were fluent in all of that. And, after 21 years, then you could probably claim to be achieving a degree of mastery in that. Okay, so we were coming into an environment, a commercial environment. Although we'd managed budgets in the Marines, multi-million-pound budgets, and hundreds of men, we were coming into a commercial environment where we didn't know how that would translate. We knew roughly the broad principles would translate. Planning is ends, ways, and means, right? Assessing a bit of risk and then executing. But we lacked the templates, we lacked the language, we lacked the fluency, we lacked what we would call doctrine. And so what we had was a challenge to translate that quickly, such that we could write a credible business plan, and then execute upon it. Now, I don't recall that. It certainly wasn't one of our biggest challenges. It was just a translational exercise. There's lots of known quantities in that Marines background. If you have a subordinate, an employee, as we translate that to now, you know exactly what his background is, his training, his skill set, what he's supposed to do. He's probably going to be of a pretty archetypal character in that environment as well. And as a small formation, he'll have a reputation, as will you. So those sorts of individuals can click in and click in with the team very quickly, and click in with your vision or your mission quite quickly as well. So there's a great deal of disorientation at first as to, from the basics to what should a functioning company structure look like. Okay, we could work out in rough functional terms. You're going to need a e-com person. You're going to need a designer, a developer, a merchandiser. What does a good one of those look like? And we had no idea. And of course, you're not paying market rates as a startup. You're cash strapped. Sure. And that actually that cash strapped nature of the whole venture was clearly of concern. You've only got so much runway. Now there are elements of that in the Marines, but generally it's resource heavy, and you get what you want and the extra firepower, let's say, that you need. So we had gone from fairly senior positions of mastery or near mastery, at least a position where you could apply that skill set to pretty much any context you're likely to find yourself in as a Marine, and adapt and overcome. And there's a long history of success in the Marines at doing that, to a couple of rather junior positions in a very new world. So that was certainly our first challenge.
So I understand the motivation for launching the brand, but motivation and doing are often two very different things. And so how quickly after you left the Marines did you set up the business? And you talked there about, having the finances to operate the business. So, did you get external funding, for example, and how was that process? And just talk, maybe a little bit about that kind of first few months from leaving and establishing the business.
The whole thing started with an email from me to Tommy, fancy setting up an outdoor clothing business. As simple as that, yeah. And Tommy, I can remember the words. He got back and said, funnily enough, I was thinking the same thing. And then we met up. Now, in answer to your question, how quickly, we started at pace, but we did it in a considered way. We both definitely had a bias to action,
Okay. Yeah.
which can be a threat as well as a good quality to have. But no, we weren't messing around. Inevitably, the whole thing goes slower than you want it to be, and that would certainly be a piece of advice that I received routinely. And I'd certainly pass that advice on. Everything takes longer than you think. I mean, first of all, you don't know how long things are going to take. You're writing your business plan with a view to getting your first hard shell out in a few months. It's not going to happen. Even now, it's a 2-year development testing cycle for those things. You can only move at the pace of your slowest supplier or the slowest functional area that's critical to delivering that pace. That bias to action, though, was important because once we were, even as we were writing the business plan and doing our market research in a very considered way, we were putting in place just the small things to get things moving. Now, I mean, it sounds laughable now, but for two ex-Marines, how do you even register a company? What is a company? What is that entity exactly? What is a company director? We knew none of that. How do you register for VAT? These little tiny bumps in the road that seem laughable now. So we've got all that sort of stuff ticked off.
But how though? What did you have somebody kind of advising you or?
Google.
Okay.
Google is your friend.
But that's, okay.
Google is your friend.
Yeah.
And for market research and so on, we reached into some of the more formal organizations, Mintel and so on, and Outdoor Eye. And really, that's just stuff at the macro level. It's not particularly useful, but it can help you form at least a long-term vision.
Yeah.
But really, it's nothing more miraculous than typing your question into Google.
Yeah.
And of course, everything then unfolds. And it's not going to unfold unless you move to make it unfold.
So, as you've already mentioned, you spent much of your career in the Royal Marines leading men. What did you learn from that experience that you've been able to put into action since, and maybe in a good and a bad way? Because I don't know, but I'm assuming the approach is maybe a little bit different in leading the people. So yeah, I'm interested to understand that.
I'm interested to understand it too, and I'm still forming thoughts on that as we go. I do think a lot about this. Leadership and management training in the Marines is taken very seriously. It's both a taught and a caught skill, right? So there's formal training periods in it. By way of example, so young officer training, which would typically be a graduate straight from university, or in my case, I'd done 3 years in the ranks before I did it. That's 15 months long with a further 9 months probation. So it's 2 years of a large part of that's 2 years of formal leadership instruction and practice. And then by way of other examples, the final leadership course I did in the Marines was year-long, postgraduate, master's level, delivered to an international cohort with King's College London as well, advising, Chartered Management Institute qualifications on top of that, and so on and so forth. Okay, so, and when you're not being formally trained, you're of course doing it every single day. Whether you're dealing with career issues or dealing with something more frightening or more immediate. Now, what that gave me, which has been useful since, was it gave me the language of leadership. And I don't mean what you're saying to people. I mean the way to think about leadership. And it gave me the tools as well, whether that's sort of styles of leadership or when leadership is necessary, when followership is necessary, different ways of thinking about it. That's been really useful. And if you think that's, to go away, for example, for a year on a leadership course, which I later taught on as well, that's a sort of luxury you're not going to find in the commercial environment. So I'm really grateful for having that behind me. With regards to specifics, you're dealing with an entity, a Marine contrasted to a civilian employee, which in many ways is the same. It's a human being. So there's need for empathy there, empathy being a large part of Marines leadership teaching course, believe it or not, but it is in many ways different. The Marines is a highly selective environment. So as I said before, you're dealing with known quantities. they will and do work 24 hours a day, as long as you're working 25, so leading from the front, which I think is very important, setting the example. First man in, last man out, all that sort of thing. As long as that's not, for show or just cosmetic, and people do that. But they're all human beings after all. I think an organisation like the Marines would possibly be, may I say, dangerous to have in a civilian environment. Not physically dangerous, but it's so mission focused. It's not slaved to a vision, because it's not like that. But it's a thorough believer in itself. Yeah. Now you want elements of that in a civilian environment, but you also want a degree of pushback, perhaps more than in the Marines. Yeah. And that's not to say that the Marines is an autocratic environment. It's not. That would be a misapprehension. Okay. We used to joke that an order from a Royal Marines officer is just the basis for a conversation amongst your subordinates. Yeah. So you give your order, you think it's winning, and then half an hour later it's all changed because they've had a conversation, they don't like it, which is very healthy, as long as it's not delaying things or it's not toxic. I think in a civilian environment, it's a little different, and I very much welcome that pushback and that advice from people actually who've been in this industry for far longer than I have and know more than I have. And just to expand on that slightly, again, after 21 years, you've done most of the jobs your subordinates have done. Yeah. So you become an expert at those. That's not the case here. I haven't done those jobs. I've done versions of those jobs as we've started up. But you have to be open to their experience and their expertise and their skills.
I didn't imagine what you were saying there about that in the Royal Marines, that there was that discussion after the order, that somehow is that though in certain situations, because one would imagine if you were in a war, in a situation like that, as you said, speed can come into it, and you don't necessarily want people questioning. So that's
yeah. So the word for that would be an order is an order, and then there's the phrase "this is an order." Okay. So that's what will get you over that. If it's going to cause a delay or some other threat due to the discursive nature of your previous commands, then this is an order would be the correct thing to do. But I can think of no instances where that would have to be done. Okay.
As well as being a co-founder and CEO, you're also a father, a husband, and a father of 3 teenage daughters. So I'm interested, what's more difficult, taking enemy fire or being a father for 3 teenage daughters? No, but seriously, on a serious note, how do you have any kind of non-negotiables to maintain that balance between personal and professional life? Because I'm assuming that, founding your own business, you just described working in the Royal Marines 24 hours a day. And I think founding your own business, I guess, sometimes can be a little bit similar. Yeah. So is there any tools that you put in place to make sure that you're able to find that balance?
I could, with hindsight, conjure up names for tools I put in place, but I think they arise organically. If you have a certain set of things in place organically, and I can talk about what they are in a moment, then that will get you through. As you said, a father of 3 teenage girls, which is potentially a nightmare as a default. I chose to rebuild a house at the same time as starting Jöttnar, so that was quite complicated. Without going into too much detail, the stresses as a father can be anything from reteaching the entire physics, biology, chemistry, and maths GCSE syllabus for a year in the evenings, which you have to do. That's your duty to do that, to get a child through her GCSEs, to dealing with one of my girls who has a life-threatening illness and is in and out of hospital, and that's improving, but that has certainly been an enormous stress. Yeah. So what do you rely on there? Well, for me, my wife, who has just enormous mettle and resilience, and was able to, whilst working as well, was able to maintain a degree of normalcy on the home front, and not lose faith in my vision with Jöttnar and recognize the stresses that come about from such an endeavor as this. But Dan, I think it's the simple things that get you through that sort of grandmother's wisdom without over-conceptualizing it. I don't think you need to. What are they? Looking after your fitness, physical health, just moving is important. You don't have to be a gym rat or a high-performing runner, but you have to move. That's where the outdoors is great for regaining that sense of perspective. And then other simple things which sound too good to be true and sound too simple. Eat your meals as a family. If you can't do that, eat your meals with your wife. That's where conversation develops, where perspective is regained. When you realize that, there's a tendency, I suppose, towards thinking you're the only one with stresses or it all revolves around you, this sort of solipsistic way of looking at things. You can be disabused of those notions when you sit around a table and either experience joy being a family or hear about their stresses. So physical fitness, maintaining your purpose, which for me was Jöttnar, and ensuring you maintain a good family environment.
As you said, the simple, but in my experience, often the simple things are the most effective. 100%. Yeah. Not always the easiest to follow, I think, in our busy lives and with all the distractions that we have. It's not always easy, but the eating as a family for me is super important.
Yeah, it's easy to neglect these things, and it requires, because they don't come naturally, it's easy not to. Like physical training, it's easy not to. As long as you do something, as long as you try to have a family meal or you try to do something, then you're halfway there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've mentioned a few times now about the benefits of being outdoors, the mental and the physical aspects. But I'm interested, were you already, let's say, a lover of the outdoors or a lover of physical activity before you joined the Royal Marines? Or was that something that was kind of instilled in you there?
No, I was already ready. I think most Marines were or are. So that was like a natural environment for me to step into.
And that was because of the way you as a family, when you were growing up, you were the same. You spent time outdoors, or
partly. I mean, we grew up not too far from Snowdonia, so we would find ourselves there, but it was nothing dramatic. Yeah. But I think my childhood demanded you to be outdoors if you wanted to do anything. There was limited. I don't think we had a television even as a family in the 1980s until the mid 80s, which is probably pretty unusual. Video games were pretty embryonic. So we would, as a kid, I'd definitely be outdoors. Was it making dens or pretending to hunt squirrels or whatever? I just flowed on from there really.
What's been looking back over the last 13 years, what's been the biggest challenge for you over those 13 years? Anything that kind of sticks out in your mind as that was tough, and what did you take away from that?
Everything's a challenge, so I'll try and distill that into the biggest, but it all becomes an amorphous blob of challenges. As I said earlier, there are some peculiarities in this industry which we didn't foresee. When we started Jöttnar, we were so naive. We thought we'll just build a factory and make our own gear. That idea lasted for about 2 weeks. But I think supply is probably been our biggest challenge, which is obviously joined at the hip with forecasting demand. Again, when you start, you have no idea how many you're going to sell. And you have no idea how many items other companies sell. Why? Because they're not going to tell you. Just as I wouldn't tell anyone our KPIs now, right? And I understand that. So we had to, fight to understand that and to understand what's normal. But what are those peculiarities of this industry? It's not clothing design and manufacture. It's outdoor technical clothing design and manufacture. There's great demands placed on this clothing, and it has to perform well. It has to last. It also has to have an aesthetic element to it as well. That takes a couple of years for each product, and then to reflect on forecast demanding and supply, we constantly got that wrong. Fortunately, we were often buying too little, which of course has its drawbacks. That's going to impact your margins and so on, and you fail to fulfill your customers' demand. And then there's been times when we've bought too much, of course, and you find ways of resolving that. But ultimately, you can't predict the future. You can make a plan, and we do that in detail. And there's always trade-offs in that, and contingency planning for when it doesn't work. But no matter how skilled your merchandiser is, she can't predict the future either. Yeah. Although she's got the tools and the science to attempt to do so. And one thing I had to learn, I hope this is answering your question about the greatest challenge, because there's so many of them, but one thing I had to learn is we always used to say in the Marines, don't confuse the map with the ground. Okay. So roughly that translates as your plan is not reality. Okay, it's just a schematic representation of a possible reality. Absolutely. Okay, so you try and be cute about it, and you develop alternate realities, contingency planning. And you assess the risk in each one, and you take a stance and attempt to deliver. But actually, I'm not sure how much credence I gave that in the Marines, because by a certain stage, your plan actually does unfold more or less with how you want it to unfold. And certainly one of the contingencies will unfold how you want it to unfold. Not all the time, but more or less. Here, what we were finding was our plans were unrepresentative of any reality that we would arrive at in 12 months' time. Okay. But we got a lot better at that. So that was very challenging, because that can leave you feeling disorientated. But you pick the best bits out and then go for it. Another challenge which weighed on us heavily was setting the correct pace of growth. There are peculiarities to this outdoor technical clothing industry which will often dictate your pace of growth. So everybody wants a unicorn. We know now that's probably highly unlikely in outdoor technical clothing. It takes time. If you want a unicorn, you'd probably be better off working in software, or dare I say athleisure or something like that. Why is pace of growth important? Well, you've only got so much runway as a young company. What's runway? It's cash. Okay. It took us just over 2 years to get our first products to market. And it was 3 jackets and a pair of hard shell salopettes. And thankfully it worked, and we sold all those. I always say, I don't know how true this is, and maybe in 10 years' time I'll have a better, more accurate idea. But I say, if you're going to start a company like this, you're going to need £3 million to start. Tommy and I put £60,000 in and raised £150,000 angel funding. So the odds were against us from the start, and you've got to really carefully consider and be realistic about your pace of growth. Otherwise the cash runs out.
I know that today you're focused on direct to consumer, but I know in the past you've done a little bit of wholesale as well. So I'm interested to understand the journey there around kind of the channel focus and why the change. And
we were amazingly the first UK direct to consumer outdoor technical clothing company. Our competitors didn't, well, they had websites, but they were catalogs essentially, or brand catalogs. And they didn't come along until 3-4 years after we had ours. It seemed to us to be the natural thing to do. Then we probably had a vague idea that your margins might be better. We certainly knew that your customer relationship would be better and your customer insights would be better, really knowing, who you're appealing to. And dealing with them face to face as well, or email to email or phone to phone, wherever it happens to be. But yeah, it seemed like the natural thing to do. And I think when we knew nothing about wholesale, e-com was natural, understandable, readily understandable. Wholesale, not so. But we did go into wholesale in our first year, and we had a great retailer who he saw what we were doing and picked us up, and that worked really well. And we stayed in wholesale for about 3 years. Okay. But what we couldn't service with a small team, when we got to our first million with 4 people, the punching above our weight, something's got to give. We couldn't service the operational mechanics of wholesale. Okay. So if you're not delivering on time because your suppliers let you down, or because you don't have the buying power to force your supplier not to let you down, that wholesale order's cancelled. And a small company, you can't take those risks. That can hold you below the waterline. So it just seemed to us sensible to pull out of that for a while. Yeah. I think, again, to expand on that sort of decision making, if I can, I reckon to dip back into the military sphere for a while, which is often where I draw from, the most impressive generals in history, and there aren't many impressive generals, but the most impressive ones know when to retreat. But there's a comma after that. It's know when to retreat, comma, and do it. So we all know when to retreat, but doing it takes some courage, takes some nerve. And wholesale was one of those situations where we applied that way of thinking, and we certainly haven't regretted that. Not to say we won't go back into that when we're ready, but that worked for us at the time.
Have you either done it, or do you consider at any point doing your own physical retail?
Yeah, we'd love to. We looked at that in some detail maybe 3 years ago. The way we conceptualized that was testing, but of course, if you're testing that, again, with a small team, with a focus on e-com, and with so many stones unturned in e-com, we thought that would result in a similar sort of situation as the wholesale one, where it would not quite be what we wanted it to be at that stage, but it's certainly something that we'll do in the future.
Who are the people that you would say have most influenced you, either professionally or personally?
People I know. I can do both. I can do both.
Whatever.
Yeah.
You prefer.
So professionally, there are certainly Marines officers I worked for who I thought were just outstanding. Very, very capable operators and leaders of men. And you can take a lot of cues from them. And they're very interested in developing your leadership as well. And I won't name them here, but there's certainly one or two commanding officers I worked for who were superb, as well as men who worked for me, essentially, who, again, just super resilient, tons of common sense, super intelligent, super committed. And to have that, to bathe in that as a Marines officer is an absolute privilege. Such quality in that organization. So lots of that was inspirational. Since then, again, there's a handful of people who I won't name. I would advise choosing your gurus and advisors very carefully. And I certainly regard public gurus with a degree of skepticism. The sort of person I'm looking for and will naturally look up to are people who've been on a similar journey to ours. People who've walked the walk. We were chatting earlier about autobiographies of business leaders, and very few of those really pull the curtain back. And when they do, it's to show you the shiny furniture, right? Yeah. Well, who's interested in that? Yeah. Okay, it can be inspirational at a certain level, but it's not much practical use you can get from that. A bit of yee-haw moment maybe, but that's about it. And I would say the same about other public-facing business gurus. Advice-wise, the same people who really understand in detail what you're trying to do. And where's that important? Probably in building a board. That's really important, because you can become poorly advised by someone who's expert in business, but it's not your business, doesn't understand the real detail of it and the real pressures. We were lucky enough to have a very early stage investor who, again, without naming him, was one of the founder investors at Rafa, the cycling brand. Okay. And he was excellent. Yeah. He got it completely. Yeah. So he was a great source of advice. And then, I don't want this to sound cliched, but the talent in the team here inspires me as well. On my one of the behaviors we have at Jöttnar is be professionals. Now, why is that there? Not because it just demands professional standards of that particular employee, but because I don't know. I'm looking at professionals who do know. Tell me what you know. Sure. So I find that very inspiring as well, and revelatory on a daily basis. Yeah. I'll probably leave. There's one of the. I think you often ask what your favorite book is.
It's coming.
It's coming. I'll hold off on.
No, go.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
The cat's out of the bag now.
Okay,
Go on.
all right.
You go for it.
Yeah, so
Let's go crazy.
yeah, yeah. I'll choose another book for later then. I was given a copy of Shoe Dog, Phil Knight, the Nike founder's book. I was only given it last year. I hadn't heard of it.
Okay.
So, like your podcast, by the way, which I think is excellent and wish I'd had a decade ago. You're welcome. No, I genuinely mean that. It's been superb resource. I wish I'd had read Shoe Dog a decade ago. So one of our younger designers gave me that book, a little more than a year ago. And I read it on a trip out to Norway, actually, to speak to some distributors there. And like many people in this industry in the last 12 months, it was fairly chaotic and disorientating, and a plan which had been unfolding quite nicely for the previous certainly 5-6 years, and was locked in and was growing really nicely. It started to just become a little bit fractured. And then I was given Shoe Dog and I read it on the Norway trip. Okay, so what have you got there with Phil Knight? You've got a guy who, he's an accountant, super accountant, nerdy type accountant. He's a Zen Buddhist, or an amateur Zen Buddhist, or certainly leans that way. And very accomplished, high-performing sportsman, running in his case. That's going to make an interesting mix anyway, right? Something interesting going to fall out of that. And he also wrote Shoe Dog much later than the events he was writing about. So he had time to reflect on what it really all meant without wishing to become all Zen. I often think that... it was Kipling who said, success and failure, imposters both the same. You don't know what something means when it happens. You think you do, but you don't really know. And over the long term, that could be what seems the worst thing that could ever happen can be the best thing. Got to allow things to develop. Again, I'm reminded of I can't remember who it was. I think a Chinese ambassador to France. And this is maybe 120 years ago, something like that. Someone will correct me on the details of the story. But the Chinese ambassador was asked what were his views on the French Revolution, which had happened a long time before. Yeah. And he said, I don't know, it's too early to tell. I like that way of thinking. And Phil Knight very much had that way of thinking. It doesn't excuse laziness or inaction, but it does give you some comfort. Allow things to unfold. And have confidence in yourself that when they do unfold, you'll be able to perform just as well as you ever have. Yeah. What I also liked about Shoe Dog, he had his I don't know what he called them, 10 principles or 10 behaviors of Nike, and one of them was it's going to be messy, and I quite liked that. Because having come from an environment that, because we were expert at it, the Marines, wasn't messy, could get messy at times, but generally wasn't messy, to a startup, which lurches from crisis to crisis, right? And it's just a hot mess. I found a great deal of reassurance that it wasn't just us. Yeah. I tell you, Dan, this is a company that Phil Knight was so confident in his vision, as are we, that even at sort of 8-figure US dollar revenue in the early 70s, he was failing to pay his employees at the end of the month, running out of cash. Not that that's ever happened to us, and I wouldn't let that happen, but he was prepared to take it that much to the wire. That was interesting to look at his view of risk, which is not necessarily mine, but inspiring nevertheless, in terms of giving you confidence in your vision.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you? I know you listened to Jürgen's episode of this podcast. Jürgen from Neurona. He recommended a podcast called Acquired.
Okay.
There's an episode on Nike. You should listen to it.
I will. Yeah, I will.
They're 3-4 hour podcasts.
Yeah.
So
I enjoy those.
Buckle up.
Yeah, I enjoy those.
But you'll also learn that list of Nike principles or whatever actually didn't come from Phil Knight. Right.
Okay.
But it's an amazing podcast, and you learn the good stuff and the bad stuff. To your point,
I think the one error Phil Knight made with that list, or with his mindset. Look, I call it an error. It's ridiculous. It's a huge commercial success, and it's a tiny point. It was he would use the metaphor, this is a war for Nike, and I think it's useful, but it's wrong-headed in the detail. But it's a useful, inspirational call. Yeah. And I also liked his live off the land behavior. Yeah. Extremely cost conscious. Any company should be, but as a startup, that's pathological cost consciousness.
So we talked about people that have influenced or inspired you. Is there any piece of advice that you've been given that really stands out? I mean, you touched on one earlier on, but anything else that really kind of stands out to you?
Again, there's probably lots, and if I could sort of bucket those into 2 or 3, if that's okay, and perhaps if I could also offer some advice of my own.
That's coming as well.
Okay, well, I'm happy to dip into that now. I refer to my earlier conversation about pace. When we had got to a certain size and we took on institutional investment from VCs, there's one particular VC I can think of who definitely would want to be named. He likes to fly below the radar. But whereas I was too hot-headed, I think, too pacey, he advised on how realistic that was, and he caused himself unnecessary stress by doing that. So that's probably been really important, I think.
So when you look back over the 13 years, what have been the best and the worst experiences over that time?
Well, I'll refer you to the ambassador, to the Chinese ambassador. I don't know. It hasn't been long enough yet to know what they all mean. Look, it's an absolute joy to have started this company and to see it flourishing. Full stop. That's a great experience. Full stop. No matter how challenging that is, that's been a joy. It's been a joy to employ people. I love doing that. The right people, obviously. And it's been a joy to attempt to take care of them and look after them to whatever degree they want to be taken care of and looked after. And so I love that every day. It's been a joy to be able to build the sort of gear that you want to build, to have complete control over that, more or less complete control over that. To digress slightly, in the early days, suppliers were not understanding quite the demands and the finesse that we wanted. So we had to bring those on as well and make sure they could deliver and do it the way we wanted it done. We were quite demanding. But it's been a joy to see those relationships flourish with the suppliers as well. And we've got some long-term suppliers now who are just great to work with, understand what we're doing. We understand their pressures as well. That works really well. The more doom-laden aspects of the whole journey, many. I think you've got to be quite comfortable with, which is hard to achieve. Quite comfortable with not knowing the future. It's not a secure pursuit. Certainly not in the early days. As I said before, extraordinarily cash conscious. Every penny's got to count. You can't do everything you want to do at the time you want to do it. You've got to be patient. And actually, to go back to joy, one of the joys has been seeing myself develop in ways that are far beyond the way I developed in the Marines. I didn't find the Marines particularly difficult. I felt very much at home there. I fell into that quite naturally. And as I said before, some of that translates, some of it doesn't. The bits that don't, it's been the challenge of translating those, attempting to be humble, listening, knowing when not to listen as well, choose your advisors carefully. that's been both a challenge and a joy as well. And then, of course, all the other challenges will be familiar to any business, whether it's supply, cash, humans, and so on.
Okay. You when you were saying there about the best things, one of them you mentioned was about hiring and working with people, and you then corrected yourself and are hiring the right people or good people, whether it's good or right. So what do you look for as a small business, that's in growth phase? And I think at that stage, the people is critical, because one person can have a big effect on a small team. So what is it that you're looking for when you're hiring people into the business?
Yeah. So conceptually, if I can start there, I am not a believer, and I think I've been proven correct on this, in the throwaway slogan "hire fast, fire fast," which may be applicable in some industries or the shape of certain companies, but you're going to have to solve the problem you're building up anyway at some point down the line. It's, without being insulting, it was Steve Jobs who, when Apple was in early stage, huge unicorn growth, he'd hired fast and to put warm bodies. I can remember the founders of ASOS, the clothing company, did something similar, to put warm bodies in chairs to deliver functions. But he it's related that he said something like, we need to get rid of all these bozos. And again, that's not to insult the bozos, just perhaps wrongly positioned. I think you've got to hire right, and for us that looks like hiring cautiously. We have made mishires, partly because we didn't really quite know what we were looking for. We didn't quite know what good looks like.
Which is normal at the start.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. As I said earlier, we know what a good Marine looks like.
Sure, yeah.
Because they're all good. But we
of course,
yeah. But we wouldn't know what a good employee civilian looks like, beyond some sort of personal characteristics that they must bring along, but technical characteristics, we wouldn't have a solid idea of that. And mishires are very difficult to deal with. And it's very sad for everybody. It's sad for the individual that you've mishired, because they may be breaking with the strain or the pressure that you're putting upon them, out of their depth, or not prepared to put in the ludicrous amount of work you have to put in a small team in the early days. I mean, it's hard, and there aren't enough hours in the day, and you have to add value, and you have to be double-hatted as well. You can't just have a graphic designer. That graphic designer also has to be an e-com expert as well. It's a very hard skill set to find, and we've been very lucky in finding those. And we've got people here who've been with us since the start, since our first employees, and we've hired nicely in the last 6 months. Yeah, so hire fast, fire fast, not for this sort of company. Hire right.
What would you do differently if you knew you wouldn't fail?
Nothing. I think we had the courage of our convictions anyway, and retain those.
Go faster, maybe?
I don't think we could have done.
Okay.
I don't think we could have done, because there are constraints on you going faster, not least cash. Even if you sell everything in that year, you then need to buy twice as much the next year and hire twice as many people. And that initiative will take another 2 years to deliver on that little step. So no, I would be as bold as to say nothing. That's not to say we wouldn't do things differently anyway, but in the, I suppose the sort of paradigm you presented there, which is if we wouldn't fail, nothing.
Okay, so what would you do differently?
Right. Okay.
You opened the door.
Yeah, I did. That's true. Well, I'd raised £3 million before I even started, but that's impossible. So that's not great advice.
But you say that, and I understand why you say that, but also haven't you proved that you don't need to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying it's been all roses, it's been great, but it's 13 years and you're sitting here.
Yeah.
So you have done it.
It's interesting when we when we took on our first institutional investment, which was 7 figures plus, the wise VC who I mentioned earlier, who's been a great source of advice, I wanted twice as much as they were willing to put on the table, and he warned against the dangers of overcapitalization. Because while you're still working things out, being overcapitalized, it allows you a buffer to work things out, but I bet half of it's wasted. And to go back to your point there, I suppose we have proved that you can start, in conditions of extreme scarcity and make it work.
So what would you do differently?
I do differently.
Other than having 3 million?
I tell you what I would do differently. I spoke earlier about knowing when to retreat and doing it. Okay. And again, you've heard me mention many times this necessity to modulate your pace of growth. I have that bias to action.
Okay. Yeah.
For good and for bad. And I have also, hopefully it's diminishing now, a terrible habit of moving ahead whilst poorly communicating the details of that to my team, because I think, well, why wouldn't they know that? Why wouldn't they just sort of lock in and do that? Well, of course they're not going to know that unless you tell them. They're in their own worlds, right? I think I've got over that now. And we had a very interesting team building session about a year ago, and we sat around a table and reintroduced ourselves, which sounds a bit hokey, but I loved it, and hopefully they did too. And spoke candidly about our strengths and weaknesses, and that was useful. And that was one of the weaknesses I spoke about, was that being a little hot-headed and moving too fast. So I would temper that slightly. I think as a startup founder, you have to do 10 things at once. You can't do 20. You mustn't be doing 1 or 2. That's not going to work either. I was trying to do 20. So I dial that back a little bit. That's the thing I would do differently. Now, where it's great to have a co-founder is Tommy's temperament is the opposite of that. Okay. He's much more West Coast, as it was put by one of the investors, and that yin and yang worked pretty well. As long as you're candid and can speak up, which can be a problem, if you're trying to maintain friendship. But the friendship is still very much there. He provided some breaks to that. So
you almost gave them out already, but let's go to the advice. I'm going to change a little bit the order. So if you could share 3 pieces of advice to future or existing leaders within the sports and the outdoor industry, what would they be?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, I wouldn't presume to offer advice to Jürgen, because I haven't walked that walk. It's not dissimilar, but Jürgen's operating on a much bigger scale. And
he is 4th generation, to be fair, in the company.
Right, so he's completely immersed and soaked in it. There's nothing I could tell him. But I could perhaps offer some advice to smaller companies or certainly early stage startup companies. Again, I will caveat this. I said, choose your gurus carefully, and I will include myself in that. I'll caveat, this is an N of 1. It's a sample of 1. It's Jöttnar. It's peculiar to our circumstances. I think you need, first of all, you need to understand yourself and your co-founder. He needs to understand himself or herself, and he or she needs to understand you. Tommy and I had a very frank conversation at the start. We knew each other from the Marines, but we had a very, very frank conversation about what we perceived as the strengths and weaknesses of each other, what might be difficult to work with, and some of that's been borne out. I would advise having that conversation. I would advise having a co-founder, full stop. I think that's crucial, and I know a lot of investors look for that as well. I think that's crucial. Bring a lot more to the table, and when things get very difficult, you've got support. Looking at yourself, I would advise, first of all, understand your biases. Understand your bias to action. That's been important for me because that controls your pace.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Just that kind of concept of bias towards action.
Sure. So if you have at one extreme, what you might dismiss as something that's just academic, that's somebody who's thinking deeply about things, conceptualizing things, has all the time in the world, but never executes. Now, it doesn't apply in the commercial world. You've got to do both. You've got to think as deeply as you can and know when to execute. But with regards to the bias, know when to not execute. And a great piece of advice I received in the military, secondhand actually, but it was from a parachute regiment general, which was don't make a decision until you have to. I think that's quite important. It's knowing when you have to, and then executing. That's important as well. And as you do your planning will allow you to see where those decision points are. Why is that important? Because you're allowing variables to accrue. If you don't have to do it now, don't do it. It might work, it might not work. It's not a necessity, don't do it. There's a necessity for strategic patience. And I can talk for a long time on that. Inspired by aforementioned amazing generals, Wellington in particular. So examine your biases, including that bias to action. There is also a necessity for realism. It's another bias, optimism bias. Optimism's important. It's contagious. It's fun to be. But it's a little too close to hope for my liking. And hope is not a strategy. Strategy is detailed planning and thought and execution. There's a guy, another military figure, a guy called James Stockdale. Stockdale was who talks to this, and boy, has he got the background to talk to it. In 1965, James Stockdale was a Skyhawk US Navy fighter pilot, and he was shot down over Vietnam, and he was held prisoner of war captive for over 7 years by the North Vietnamese. And he was held in a prison compound with what became known as the Alcatraz gang. There were about 11 or so Navy aviators who were held with him, some of whom didn't make it out. He was held mostly in solitary confinement for that 7 years. His cell was 3 feet by 9 feet, with a single light bulb on the ceiling, which was on 24 hours a day, and he was in iron leg shackles every night. So, privation beyond anything we can imagine. Okay. And James Stockdale, who, not unsurprisingly, became a philosopher at Yale later and specializing in Stoic philosophy, he was asked what were the qualities of people who made it out of such conditions. And he said, if I can get his quote roughly right, you must never confuse faith, which you can never afford to lose, with the realities of your current situation. And there's a paradox in that. The people who didn't make it out would have an unrealistic optimism, which is a hope, which is different from a faith, from a vision, which this business has, that they would be released by Christmas. That would then be moved to Easter, and then the next Christmas. And effectively, as a result of that, they would psychologically and physically decay and die of what is effectively a broken heart and not make it out. So I love that paradox. That optimism bias is well worth examining. It's not an excuse for not planning, but having a vision and a faith is contagious and is well worth having.
Yes, absolutely.
And if I can give one last piece of advice to founders as well, if I may, I think you need a sufficient, not pathological, but a sufficient degree of paranoia. The odds are stacked against you, and you've got to know that. Paranoia delivers contingency planning. Again, not pathological paranoia, but a sufficient degree of paranoia. You've got to know what you're up against. And if you allow that to be constructive and to deliver that contingency planning, then that's a quality, let's call it, that's worth having.
You're not the first person to mention that.
Is that right?
To say, yeah.
Oh, I'm relieved about that. Okay.
Yeah. But it's not something I hear a lot.
Right.
But I think it's a good reality check.
Yeah.
So, more fun question. So, what's your favourite piece of sports or outdoor gear? And it can't be something from Jöttnar.
Okay.
That's way too easy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have an easy answer as well. I'm not sure if they still exist, but there was a Italian ski company called Tua, Tua.
Okay.
And it's one of those companies. If you knew about Tua, you knew about Tua,
Okay.
right? And they used to make amazing telemark skis,
Okay.
which were great for piste telemark or for ski touring and so on. And I had the iconic ski of the time. This is 20 years ago now. It was called a Tua Sumo, which was fat for the day. It was 110 millimeters at the tip. Imagine that, right? That skis are broader than that, wider than that underfoot now. Yeah. That was a fantastic ski with amazing camber. And I took that everywhere. And I also used it in the Marines as well. That was my military ski. The military skis that they issued then were 210 centimeters long. I don't know, 10 centimeters underfoot, something ridiculous, totally unsuitable. So that was also my military ski. Fantastic, 185 centimeter, 110 at the tip. Amazing camber, brilliant for telemarking, super cool brand. That sticks with me.
Very cool. Another one I've not heard. That's good.
Okay.
You already gave one book, but any others that stick out that you would recommend?
Yeah. I would read, me personally, I would read anything about Wellington, Duke of Wellington. Okay. Now, the Duke of Wellington, that sounds like a comedy name today, but anything by any credible historian about Wellington, in particular about his period in the Peninsular Wars, which are the wars in the early 1800s in France and Spain. In Portugal and Spain, fighting France, fighting Napoleon. Wellington was super technocratic general, super all over the detail, trusted nobody, including his subordinates. Was a very present and visible leader. Probably not, the records show, probably not very easy to work for. He was a man under a great deal of pressure. He took the British Army to Portugal, and he spent around 5 years there doing what looked like nothing except retreating and building defensive positions. Great parliamentary clamour for him to be sacked because he's doing nothing. But this is strategic patience, which I spoke to earlier. And then when he was ready, he knew where his decision point was. And when he was ready, he defeated 5 Napoleonic generals in a row in the course of I think about a year. I may be wrong. And then entered France. And then not much longer later, won the Battle of Waterloo. Okay, so real interesting mix, right, of a guy who, technocrat, strategic general, strategic patience, doesn't look like a risky shooting from the hip kind of guy, and normally isn't. And then Waterloo, I can't think of a more shooting from the hip battle, a more risky battle. Saved, it's contentious, but saved in the last hour by the arrival of the Prussians. And certainly during a part of that day, it's recorded that Wellington had pretty much decided that he'd been beaten unless they arrived in the next, X minutes, which they did, and they put the French army to flight. Now, again, this may be of interest to some of your audience, but I contrast him with Napoleon. A very, complex character psychologically, imbued with an imperial vision, very much a hot mess kind of guy. But by the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars, he'd run out of money. That could sound familiar. His allies were turning against him, and ended up in captivity on an island, dead, aged 52, in an extremely unhealthy physical condition. I think I know who I'd rather be.
Yeah. Well, okay, super interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. Don't check it out too closely. It's probably all wrong, but that's my version of it.
No, but I mean, looking for something to read about it, because it's been, since school would have been the last time I
Yeah, it's
something like that.
forgotten guy now.
Yeah. So, as you know, this podcast is really designed to provide people with insights and lessons learned, successes, failures, anybody that either is or wants to work in the sports and the outdoor industry. And we've covered quite a lot today, but is there anything that you think we've missed or that you would like to still add?
I don't think so. I would say it's a great space to work in. You know, you're mixing your passions and hobbies with your business. I mean, what could be better than that? I think I covered a lot of ground there. I'm not sure how much of that is accurate, but maybe you come back in 10 years' time, there'll be a lot more to add.
Absolutely. So last question then. So if today was your last day,
on Earth or at Jöttnar?
At Jöttnar, let's say. That's on Earth is a little too dramatic.
Okay.
What would your message be to your team?
Well, assuming I'm leaving under conditions of success for the company and stepping aside for someone more talented, I'd actually just like to thank them, which I hope I do enough, and commend them for their serious commitment and effort and hard work. They have their own lives and challenges just as I do, and I recognize that. So just be a big thank you.
Perfect. What a great way to finish. Thank you very much, Steve, for your time. It's amazing what you've achieved so far. So congrats. I look forward to coming back in 10 years and seeing what that holds and seeing how the brand develops.
I hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you did, please leave a comment below. A new episode will go live in 2 weeks, so subscribe to be sure you don't miss it. Thanks again for your support and see you soon.